the death of freedom. Before the world knew the face of tyranny, Germany knew freedom. The Weimar Republic, born from the ashes of World War I, was chaotic, loud, and alive. It was a place of ideas, art, and argument. Newspapers shouted from every corner. Writers debated politics in cafes. People voted, protested, disagreed, and believed that freedom, fragile as it was, could survive. But freedom, to the desperate, can look like weakness. To a nation humiliated by defeat, burdened by debt, and crushed by inflation, democracy felt like disorder. While Berlin danced to jazz and modernity, millions starved. And in that hunger, a new voice rose, one that promised certainty instead of choice. Hitler's genius wasn't just hatred, it was understanding despair. He told Germans that freedom had failed them, that liberty was chaos, that equality was weakness, that democracy was a disease brought by foreigners and Jews. He promised unity instead of division, strength instead of confusion, destiny instead of doubt, and people listened. They voted away their own rights, believing they were saving themselves. When the Reichstag burned in 1933, freedom burned with it. The press was silenced, unions outlawed, opposition crushed. Citizens who once spoke their minds now whispered in fear, because even silence could be a crime. Within months, Hitler had dismantled every pillar of democracy. The Constitution still existed on paper, but it meant nothing. The courts bowed to the Führer, the police served the party, and the people saluted their new master, convinced they were free. Freedom didn't die with violence. It died with applause, with people cheering for order, safety, and pride, unaware they were burying the very thing that made them human. In a land that once celebrated open debate, only one voice remained. And in that silence, the laughter of mockery began, aimed across the ocean, at a country that still believed in the very thing Germany had just killed: freedom, the gospel of obedience. Once liberty was gone, obedience became a religion. The swastika replaced the cross, and the Führer became the god of a new gospel, one that preached devotion over doubt and submission over truth. Every child in Nazi Germany was taught that freedom was dangerous. In schools, lessons praised discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty. Books that spoke of individuality or equality were burned. The state didn't just control actions, it controlled thought. At home, families were divided by fear. Children joined the Hitler Youth and reported parents for speaking against the regime. Neighbors turned each other in to the Gestapo for careless jokes. To survive, people learned not to think freely, but to think safely. Freedom had been traded for unity, and unity had become a cage. Millions accepted it because it was easier to obey than to question. When everyone around you salutes, silence feels like rebellion. When lies echo loud enough, truth becomes treason. The Nazis built an empire on that obedience. Trains ran on time. Speeches promised greatness. The masses marched in perfect rows, mistaking choreography for strength. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America looked like chaos. Strikes, debates, elections, protests. To Nazi eyes, it was proof that democracy didn't work. Propaganda films mocked the disorder of American life. Women voting, workers striking, jazz playing in smoky clubs. They called it decadence, proof that a nation built on freedom couldn't survive discipline. But what the Reich never understood was that disorder was democracy's heartbeat. That freedom looks messy because it is, and that noise is the sound of people thinking for themselves. In Germany, silence ruled, and silence would become the soundtrack of tragedy. For when no one can speak, no one can stop what comes next. The mockery of democracy. Once Germany had silenced its own dissent, it turned its laughter outward. Nazi propaganda found a new target: America. To them, the United States was not a superpower but a circus. A land of immigrants, jazz, and politics so divided it seemed absurd. Hitler's ministers mocked its elections as chaos, its constitution as naive, its freedom as weakness. In the pages of Der Angriff and Völkischer Beobachter, America became a caricature, the land of mongrels, run by capitalists and Jews, poisoned by the idea that all men were equal. Goebbels' propaganda machine painted democracy as a failed experiment. Why give power to the people, they asked, when the people don't know what to do with it? They sneered at Roosevelt's speeches, mocked the talking shops of Congress, and laughed at strikes and protests as signs of decay. To them, America's diversity wasn't its strength, it was its disease. They compared the German Volk, pure, obedient, unified, to America's melting pot of races and religions, calling it degenerate and doomed. But behind the mockery was insecurity. The Nazis knew what they'd destroyed: freedom, individuality, conscience. They envied the energy they saw in the American press, the inventiveness of its workers, the confidence of its culture. So they did what all tyrants do when faced with what they fear. They ridiculed it. They laughed at Hollywood's optimism, at jazz music's chaos, at the idea that ordinary citizens could challenge their leaders. But those were the very things that made America unpredictable and powerful. While Germany marched in perfect lines, America improvised. While the Reich demanded silence, America argued out loud. And when war came, that noise, that freedom, would become the greatest weapon the Nazis could never control. The Reich believed freedom made a nation weak, but they were about to learn. It's what makes a nation impossible to enslave: the price of submission. The deeper Germany sank into obedience, the higher the price became. At first, it didn't look like tyranny. It looked like unity. Flags everywhere, parades, smiles. People believed they were part of something greater than themselves. But soon the illusion began to crack. Neighbors disappeared in the night. Jewish shops were smashed. Books were banned. Fear crept into every home, silent and absolute. Freedom had been traded for protection, but now there was no protection from the state itself. The same citizens who once cheered Hitler's rise now whispered his name in dread. Every word could be betrayal. Every thought could be fatal. The Gestapo didn't just punish crimes, they punished opinions. Workers who questioned production quotas vanished. Priests who spoke of mercy were imprisoned. Artists who painted the truth were silenced forever. The people had wanted a leader who would bring order. Instead, they got a system where even order meant death. When obedience becomes a virtue, conscience becomes a crime. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the same democracy they mocked continued to evolve, loud, chaotic, imperfect, but alive. American citizens protested war, debated policy, criticized leaders, and faced no prisons for it. While Germans saluted one man, Americans argued with 100. And that argument, that freedom to disagree, was exactly what made them stronger. By the late 1930s, the cost of silence could be seen everywhere: in the burning synagogues of Kristallnacht, in the lines of concentration camps, in the terrified eyes of those who had once believed in the fatherland. Freedom had seemed like a luxury Germany could live without. Now it was a memory Germany would die without. And soon, the armies of democracy, the very symbol of what they had scorned, would return to remind them what freedom truly costs. The coming of the liberators. By 1944, the noise that once echoed across Europe, the marching boots, the shouting crowds, the roaring speeches, had turned to silence. The Reich was crumbling. Cities that once waved red banners now burned under the weight of their own lies. And from the west came a new sound, deep, steady, mechanical. Engines, American engines. The land of chaos, as Nazi propaganda had called it, was now crossing the Atlantic in steel and fire. The sons of the democracy they'd mocked were landing on the beaches of Normandy. Farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, teachers from New York, young men who had grown up believing that freedom wasn't just a word but a duty. They didn't march in perfect lines. They stumbled through the surf, scared, soaked, and human. But they kept moving, because the one thing they carried that the Reich never could was belief. Belief that liberty was worth dying for. As the Allied armies pushed through France, the myth of Nazi invincibility began to collapse. German soldiers, once proud, now saw the endless waves of American tanks, trucks, and planes, built in factories they had once ridiculed. Each machine was a piece of democracy forged in steel. Each advance, a reminder that freedom doesn't need perfection, it only needs perseverance. When U.S. forces liberated Paris, people wept in the streets. For the first time in years, they shouted without fear. Flags waved again, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. To those who had lived under dictatorship, American freedom wasn't chaos anymore. It was breath itself. Every mile the Allies advanced, every camp they opened, every prisoner they freed, proved the same truth. Freedom is fragile, but tyranny is mortal, and soon that truth would reach Germany's own doorstep. The shattered illusion. When the Americans entered Germany, they didn't come as conquerors, they came as proof. Proof that everything the Nazis had promised was a lie. The Germans had been told for years that the Americans were greedy, lazy, degenerate, a collapsing society of mongrels and fools. But when they saw the soldiers marching into their towns, handing chocolate to children, and sharing rations with the hungry, the illusion shattered. Women who had spent a decade living in fear now saw something they hadn't seen in years: decency. These men who spoke of liberty, who smiled without suspicion, were nothing like the monsters propaganda had painted. Many Germans couldn't understand it. How could an army that had crushed them in battle show such mercy in victory? How could a people so divided by race, religion, and class fight so fiercely together? They realized, perhaps for the first time, that democracy's strength was not in its order, but in its heart. The freedom to speak, to dissent, to dream, that was what gave it power. And for those who had lived under dictatorship, it was both foreign and magnetic. As the Allies opened concentration camps, the final veil fell. The full horror of obedience without conscience lay bare before the world. The prisoners who stumbled out of the barbed wire were not enemies. They were reminders of what silence can cost. In towns across Germany, people who had mocked American freedom now stood face to face with what their discipline had built. They had traded liberty for order and found hell waiting. But even as their world fell apart, something unexpected happened. They began to listen to the radio broadcasts, the leaflets, the voices of the very democracy they had despised. For the first time, freedom didn't sound like weakness. It sounded like hope. And in that silence, in that stunned, broken quiet, Germany began to understand that what they had called chaos was actually life itself, from conquest to compassion. When the shooting stopped, Germany expected vengeance. Its people had lived in terror for so long that they assumed the conquerors would bring the same cruelty their own leaders had shown. But the Americans didn't come with whips and slogans. They came with food. Across ruined cities, U.S. soldiers set up field kitchens for starving families. They handed out rations to the same civilians who had once cheered Hitler's armies. Children who had been taught to fear black GIs and Jewish officers now reached up for chocolate bars from their hands. It was a quiet revolution, the transformation of power into mercy. For many Germans, this was the moment the world turned upside down. The so-called decadent democracy was rebuilding the nation that had tried to destroy it. And it did so not out of conquest, but conviction, because freedom, to America, was an export as much as an ideal. U.S. soldiers didn't force Germans to kneel. They made them rebuild. They cleaned streets, reopened schools, printed newspapers. They insisted on truth, showing civilians films of the concentration camps, confronting them with what obedience had cost. Then they gave them pencils and paper and told them to start writing again. From that rubble, freedom took root. Slowly, fear gave way to curiosity. Children learned new words: vote, choice, rights. Old men argued in cafes again. Women who had once whispered in fear began to speak out loud. The same country that had burned books now reopened libraries. The same press that once printed lies now printed debate. And all around them stood the same soldiers they had mocked, teaching them that liberty wasn't chaos, it was courage. When General Lucius Clay oversaw the U.S. occupation, he said something remarkable: better to build democracy on hunger than tyranny on plenty. That became America's quiet victory, conquering not through destruction, but through decency. For Germany, the lesson was beginning. Freedom, once mocked, had returned, not with a sword, but with an outstretched hand. The birth of a new Germany. From the ashes of dictatorship, a new nation began to breathe. It was fragile, uncertain, and full of ghosts, but it was alive. In the American zone of occupation, democracy wasn't just imposed, it was taught. German citizens were invited to attend town meetings, elections, and public debates. Allied officers didn't tell them what to think, they showed them how to think for themselves again. Schools reopened with new textbooks. Teachers replaced Nazi slogans with lessons on liberty and justice. Students who once drew swastikas on their notebooks now learned about the Bill of Rights. For the first time, Germans saw that authority could exist without fear. In 1949, West Germany adopted a new constitution, das Grundgesetz, the basic law, built on principles America had carried across the ocean: freedom of speech, equality before the law, and the protection of human dignity. It was a constitution born from shame, but written with hope, and it worked. Within a few years, political parties re-emerged, newspapers flourished, and citizens voted freely again. The same people who once raised their arms in obedience now raised their voices in disagreement, and that was progress. The Marshall Plan brought more than money, it brought confidence. Factories reopened with American assistance, trade networks revived. Young Germans traveled abroad and saw that democracy wasn't chaos, it was creation. The soldiers left, but their lessons stayed. In the ruins of a fallen Reich, Germany discovered that freedom wasn't an American gift, it was a human necessity. And for the first time in a generation, people began to believe again, not in a leader, but in themselves. Freedom, once feared, now felt like oxygen. And as the Cold War dawned, West Germany would cling to it desperately, because they knew what life without it had cost. The dependence on liberty. Freedom came slowly, and at a cost. Post-war Germany was a nation of ruins and ration cards. Its people were free, yes, but also hungry, traumatized, and lost. And in that vacuum, America became more than an occupier. It became a lifeline. The Marshall Plan wasn't charity, It was philosophy. It declared that liberty couldn't survive on empty stomachs. So America sent billions in food, steel, fuel, and machinery, not to dominate, but to rebuild. For every shipment that arrived, Germany learned something profound. Democracy feeds. Dictatorship starves. Factories that had once produced tanks now turned out typewriters and washing machines. Streets filled with the smell of bread instead of smoke. The same American trucks that once carried soldiers now delivered hope, but dependence ran deeper than food and fuel. Germany had lost its moral compass. Its schools, its laws, its very idea of truth had been poisoned. And it was through America's relentless example, open elections, free press, independent courts, that the country began to find itself again. At first, many resisted. Pride dies slowly. They still saw the Americans as arrogant victors, their culture loud and intrusive. But every time the US allowed a newspaper to criticize it, every time a protest was tolerated without punishment, Germans noticed something powerful. This wasn't control, this was confidence. Freedom, they realized, wasn't just a political system, it was a mindset. The courage to question, to fail, to stand alone. The very thing they once mocked was now the one thing they couldn't live without. As West Germany rose from the rubble into the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, its foundations weren't built on concrete and steel. They were built on the rediscovery of liberty, the lesson they couldn't deny. By the 1950s, Germany was unrecognizable. The streets that once echoed with marching boots now hummed with factory engines and laughter. Children who had saluted portraits of Hitler were now pledging allegiance to freedom itself. But the scars remained. Every generation that followed would ask the same question: how did we let it happen? How did we mock the very thing that would one day save us? The answer was everywhere, in classrooms, in history books, in quiet conversations. Freedom had seemed fragile, decadent, even foolish, yet it had outlasted an empire that called itself eternal. And as America turned its attention to the Cold War, Germany stood at a crossroads between two worlds, two ideologies. In the West stood democracy, in the East, dictatorship reborn. This time, Germans chose differently. They built their future on freedom, not because it was perfect, but because they had lived without it. When President Kennedy visited Berlin in 1963 and declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner," the cheers weren't for him alone. They were for what he represented, the proof that liberty could return, even after total collapse. The nation that once mocked American freedom had become its fiercest student, and though pride, politics, and memory would shift with time, one truth remained carved into history. Freedom may falter, it may stumble, and it may suffer, but it never dies where people remember what it cost to lose it. Because freedom isn't American or German, it's human, and the story of how one nation mocked it, lost it, begged for it, and finally learned to guard it is the story of us all.